Bava Batra Daf Kuf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph, completion, Nekel Be'eshet Ish. So here we have a case where a man dies, leaving no children, and as far as we know, he has no brothers. So he dies without children. There would normally be a chiyuv yibum. The brother would need to marry the widow, but we don't know that there are, as far as we know, there are no brothers. However, there's a report that in a distant country overseas, there are witnesses who claim that there's a brother. That's the case that we have. And the Gemara wants to bring a proof from a similar situation with Shvuya, where a woman says, I've been captured, I've been released now, and while I was in captivity, I was not raped, nobody did anything with me, that she's believed. The Gemara wants to draw comparisons from that. And then Abaya says, Im hekalnu b'shvuya nekel be'eshet ish. You can't bring a proof from the case of Shvuya, because the case of Shvuya, this captive woman, is different from the case of Eshet Ish. Here we're dealing with a much more serious issue. We're dealing with Eshet Ish, with a woman who was married, and a question of whether she's allowed to remarry or she needs chalitza. That's a much more serious issue. Says the Rashbam, Rashbam explains that. This Eshet Ish is so serious, this case of being a married woman, De'ika Isur Chenek. What is the consequence? What is the punishment for a woman who has a relationship, a married woman who has a relationship with another man? That's a capital offense. The prohibition is chenek. V'harehi b'cheskat isur adata. And she is still in a situation of being forbidden. We haven't yet declared that she's permitted to marry anybody. She was an Eshet Ish before her husband died. Now her husband died, but there might be a yabam, there might be a brother. Va'al tatirena misafek kivan de'amri inshidi ka'edim b'mdinat hayam shezkuka yabam. Since we hear that there are witnesses somewhere in the world who know that there's a brother, we can't be mad to her, we can't allow her to remarry. Explains the Rashbam. The question that the Bach and many others ask is, she's not an Eshet Ish. What does the Gemara mean she's an Eshet Ish? And what does the Rashbam mean? She's a widow. We know that her husband's died. So one thing she isn't is a married woman. She's not an Eshet Ish. The question is she a Shomeret Yabam or isn't she? Is she in need of Chalitza? Does the Yabam, does the deceased's brother have to release her with Chalitza? As the Torah says in the Posuk up at the top, Ki yeshvu achim yachdav u'meit echad mehem uvein ein lo. If two brothers are living together and he dies, one of them dies without a son, lo tiyeh eshet hamet hachutza. The widow doesn't marry out of the family, leish zar, to a strange person. Yevama yavo alea. It's the Yabam, it's the brother, her brother-in-law, who takes her as a wife, or, as the Apostle goes on to say, he does chalitza and releases her to marry anybody else. But at that moment, she is not an Eshet Ish, she's a widow, possibly a Shomeret Yabam. But why does the Gemara say Eshet Ish, and why does the Rashbam say we're talking about an Isur Chenek? Says the Bach, Afagav dachshav eina Eshet Ish. You're right, she's really not an Eshet Ish. And there's really not chenek. It's not a capital offense, and she's not an Eshet Ish. Kiyim lav, there's a prohibition of the Torah, de lo tiyeh eshet hamet hachutza, that the wife of the husband of this deceased person should not marry out. That's what the Torah says, and that's what she's got to observe. But it's not a capital offense. If she does marry somebody else, it's not a capital offense, it's an Isur lav. Mikol makom, me'achal, the Bach says an amazing and a strange thing. Me'achal de kodim shemet ba'ala hayta becheskat Eshet Ish. Before her husband died, she had the chazokah. We assumed her to be an Eshet Ish. Her status was one of Eshet Ish, of married woman. Adayin becheskat oto isur omedet. She remains in that status of an Eshet Ish. V'zeu isur chenek, and that's an isur chenek. That's a capital offense. Lo chenek mamash. It doesn't mean she would get chenek, that she would be put to death if she married somebody else. No, that's not so. Mamash rak isur chenek shahaya ba lo nistalek mimena. But the capital offense which she would have had before he died remains attached to her ad sheniftara mizikat yevama, until she gets chalitza and she detaches herself from the brother-in-law, from the yevama. So she remains in that status of married. Rabbi Kiva asks the same question and doesn't answer it, so he obviously isn't happy with the Bach's answer. He doesn't reference the Bach, he just asks the question and he doesn't answer it. But what we seem to be dealing with here is something very important in our understanding of Yibum, and from it a principle of life that's very important too. And if we go back to Gemaras that we did in Kiddushin and in Yevomis, we'll begin to understand it. And that is, you might remember from our work in Yevomis that the marriage that takes place when a woman marries a man, she's not only marrying the man, she's marrying his family too. That's a social thing and an emotional thing, and it's important. Often you'll hear girls saying, I don't care about his family, I'm marrying him, what do I care about his family? It doesn't work that way. The family is important and you're marrying into the family. But it goes even further halachically. You actually, when you say Kedat Moshe Yisrael, when he stands under the chuppah, and I guess Rabbonim should explain this to husbands, to men and women under the chuppah. When you say, I'm marrying you Kedat Moshe Yisrael, one of the laws of Moshe Yisrael is, and if I pass away before we have children, you will need chalitza from my brother. So you better stay in his good books. Don't get on the wrong side of him because he can make your life a misery. You should know that up front. And if you think my brother's a bad character and could hold it against you, you'd better not marry me. That's something that we should be teaching to them at the times of marriage. Rashi, for example, in Kiddushin, where the Gemara is discussing about whether an intimate relationship could initiate a marriage as it does in Yevama. In the case of a Yevama, there's no chuppah, there's no chuppah in Kiddushin as such. The intimacy itself is the act of marriage. Could that apply in other cases? The Gemara goes backwards and forwards, and Rashi says there, when a man dies, the woman automatically finds herself in the purview of the brother. Machmat kiddushe hamet, because of the kiddushin that was done initially with the dead husband. That kiddushin, that act of marriage, included the brother. He was part of it. Ve'ein bi'ah ba'ala ligmor. And when they actually get together, when the brother-in-law does yibum, that's just finishing off what was started under the chuppah. It's a long process that ends with the yibum and starts under the chuppah. Aval kinyan de beikara law, but that's not an initiating kinyan. The fact that the yabam is intimate with his sister-in-law, that is not what creates the kinyan. The kinyan was created under the chuppah. Tosfos says something similar in the name of Rabbi Elazar Mishazne. We're not sure who that is. Rabbi Elazar Mishazne, it appears a few times in Tosfos. Piresh, sheken zekuka v'omedet, shibi'ah zu eina osa ela gomeret kiddushay rishon. The Tosfos is even more specific. Their intimacy, this brother-in-law with a sister-in-law, merely completes a kiddushin which was effected under the chuppah with the brother, with the deceased. Certainly, Bia can't initiate a kinyan just because it can be used to finish a kinyan. It's finishing a kinyan that Bia it doesn't actually start a kinyan. And that being the place, what the Bach seems to be saying is, when this man dies, there are no sons, so there's a potential for yibum. We hear that there are witnesses somewhere overseas who claim that there is a brother. So she's not yet released since there's not a completion. A kinyan was done under the chuppah. What was that kinyan? You're marrying me and you will marry my brother in the event that I die without children. That was part of that kinyan. And that's still there. It's true that if she ignores it and she marries somebody else, she's not going to get capital offense. But that issue, that prohibition of Eshet Ish has not yet removed. Only Chalitza can move it. Or only the determination that there is no brother can terminate that, because she's in the middle of a process, as Rashi and Tosfos say in Kiddushin. She's in the midst of a process that starts with Kiddushin and ends with Biur. It's true that in the process, the nature of the punishment changes. It's now become a lav, whereas previously it was an Isur Chenek. The consequence changes, but the status as such doesn't really change. Although she's not an Eshet Ish technically, but she still has something of that Eshet Ish quality, that married woman quality, until she's released by Chalitza. We see that further. Rabbi Yosef Engel was important. He was the Rav and a Rosh Yeshiva in Krakow in the second half of the 19th century, and he was one of the first people who started the style of learning that was later followed by Reb Shimon Shkop, introducing philosophic principles into understanding halacha. And he writes something similar. The prohibition of a woman who's waiting for chalitza from her brother-in-law, the prohibition of her to marry anybody else, is not a separate prohibition in the laws of Yibum. It's part of Ishut. It's as if she's an Esed Ish. V'shelo nistalek adayin Ishut habal, because the husbandhood of the deceased husband has not yet terminated, because something started under the chuppah which isn't yet finished. Rak niklash mimita lelav. It's just been diluted. It's no longer a capital offense, it's now a lav. But it's still the same offense. And that's a really important concept that Rabbi Yosef Engel is introducing, and that is, we tend to judge actions or the severity of an action by the severity of the consequence. And that's not correct. That might be fine legally, but it's not right morally. So for example, if somebody says, I ran a red light, but it's okay, nobody was hurt, does that make the Aveira less? Morally, no. Running a red light is a terrible thing to do, no matter what the consequences were. It doesn't mean because there were no consequences, that makes it less serious. You've got to separate the consequence and the definition of the wrongdoing when it's a case of wrongdoing. Even as a person drives recklessly on the freeway, but he comes and he says, okay, I'm safe, I didn't have an accident, everybody's fine. No, everybody's not fine. You did something terrible, you did something reckless, you did something dangerous, you did something morally wrong, and halachically wrong as well. The same it is with, for example, in Isurim. If somebody is Mechalo Shabbos, and he does it b'mezid, with hatra'ah, person lights a fire on Shabbos, he's warned by two Eidim, he does it nevertheless, the Eidim see it, that's an Isu Skila. What happens if he did it without Eidim? So there's no Skila. Does that mean it's not an Isu Skila? Because he can't get Skila? No, circumstances are such that he can't get Skila, but it's still an Isu Skila. That's what Rabbi Yosef Engel means as he explains the Bach. What this means is it's still called an Isu Chenek, even though you're not going to get Chenek for it. Because that's where it started. It started off as an Isu Chenek, and it's not yet complete. It's just been diluted in the process. Don't worry about the consequences. The fact is, she still has the severity of an Eshet Ish in a way. And a similar approach we see in Rabbi David Hoffman. Rabbi David Hoffman was a very great Talmud Chacham who succeeded Rav Hildesheimer as the head of the Berlin Rabbinical Seminary, which was a very choshev yeshiva. It was like the first yeshiva university. They used to study secular work as well, so as to be able to occupy positions in Germany and Western Europe. And this was all part of the Hirsch philosophy of trying to stem the Haskalah movement, enlightenment, with rabbis who can talk the language of modern people. But Rabbi David Hoffman himself was from Poland. He was a Talmud of the Maram Shik, an enormous Talmud Chacham. And he writes on the Chumash that Ha'ach ha'met hitchil livnot bayit kasher nasa et ishto. What is Yibum? Yibum is not because we feel bad for the wife. And he proves that it's got nothing to do with feeling bad for the widow. That's not the reason for Yibum. It's that the dead person started building a home. V'lo hispik legomro, and he didn't manage to finish it. It's going along the same line as Rabbi Yosef Engel goes, and they lived at the same period. Kivan shelo zacha lezera sheyekayem et shmo v'yirash et nechasav. He wasn't zoiche to have sons who could follow on him. Al ken sifta Torah la'achiv ligmol chesed im hamet. So the Torah instructs the brother to do a chesed. What's the chesed? Lakum tachtav ligmor et binyano shehitchil bo u'lahakim lo zera. To help him finish what he started. He started something and he can't finish it. That's a terrible thing. That's a terrible agmas nefesh. And we see here the importance of that chesed. We can't just look at somebody's unfinished work and say, well, he's passed away, so wrap up the estate and we're done. What about finishing the things he started? He was about to publish a sefer. What about publishing it? What about getting it out? He was about to complete a transaction. What about completing it? There are things to do. He was about to start an institution. What about starting and finishing, doing what he was doing? That's an amazing chesed. When somebody dies, we just get involved in wrapping up. We think chesed shalemis is burying him and sitting shiva for him and doing the avelus and then divvying up the estate and finished. Then we move on with life. No, there's a major mitzvah we learn from Yibum, ligmor et binyano shehitchil bo, to help somebody finish something they started and are unable to finish. They may have run out of funds. They may have run out of strength. They may have become ill. What a chesed it is, what a kindness it is to step in and finish off what they started. That's what we learn from Yibum. Something much more than just the technical issues of the Yibum itself. And it's interesting, Reb Chaim Altuski in the Chiddush, Reb Chaim Altuski was the son-in-law of Reb Pinchas Scheinberg. He only passed away a few years ago. He was also a Talmud of Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik. And he mentioned something similar here. Ikara isur shechenek nishar bimkomo keilu achiv kayam. That isur chenek, that prohibition of chenek, sits there. Although it's diluted, it still sits there. So we see a trend in these achronim and understanding Yibum and this whole piece of Gemara in a way that the Bach makes enormous sense. The understanding that sometimes a prohibition can be diluted, but it's diluted only in its consequence. It's not diluted in its essence. It's still called an Isur Chenek, even though she's not going to get capital punishment for doing anything. But the essence of the prohibition is there. And we need to look at that not just in terms of, well, it's just a love. It's not, or it was a shogeg. Even if one does something b'shogeg, it's still an Isur Skila. One does something b'shogeg, one lights the fire on Shabbos, in the example that we just gave, and you say, but it was b'shogeg, it's only b'shogeg, so it's only a chiyuv chatas. No, it's a chiyuv skila. It's just because you didn't do it deliberately that you can't get skila, but you've been over and it's a skila. That's what we've got to be able to look at the action and define its seriousness in its own halachic and moral definition, irrespective of whether or not the consequence has been diluted because of circumstance. And to understand also this importance of to step in when somebody started something and one was unable to finish it, ligmor et binyano sheitchil bo, to fulfill the chesed that the Torah teaches us to help somebody complete something that they put their life into but weren't able to complete.